So, in 1916, Jeannette Rankin of Montana made history by becoming the first female elected to Congress. And she was soon followed by Alice Robertson of Oklahoma and Winifred Huck of Illinois. And these three women were the focuses of my research. So at the time that these women were elected, women were essentially second-class citizens. They had only just been granted suffrage in 1919. So I thought it was important to study their entrances into Congress, considering it was such a major breakthrough. I also think it's necessary because research of early congresswomen usually either focuses on just Jeannette Rankin as a solitary historical figure, the first female in Congress, or it picks out general trends of all congresswomen from World War I to World War II, trends such as the widow succession, where a woman follows her deceased husband into Congress, generally is appointed to that position, not elected. But these trends, none of these women fit into these trends, and so I thought it was necessary to figure out how the first three congresswomen made it happen. So my general question, how and why did Rankin, Robertson, and Huck get elected? And more specifically, what role does gender play in these elections? And the theory I chose to use is based on a study by Perkins and Fowlkes done in 1980, and they concluded that voters react negatively towards women who assert that they should be elected over their male rivals only because they are women. That is their sole distinguishing quality, and they are running for the sake of equality, of gender equality. So given that this was done in 1980, I made the assumption that 60 years earlier such a reaction would be even more negative, and these women had to deal with that. So I suspected that key similarities would exist among the three women that would roughly explain how their collective breakthrough into Congress. And then with regard to gender, I suspect that they did not regard, or they did not emphasize gender equality as a primary rationale for seeking election. Of course, they couldn't ignore or hide their gender just as women even today can't. So this was something that they kind of had to balance out and work with. So how I went about doing this, I first looked at biographies of all three women, and I traced similarities among the three. This led into an investigation of the campaigns themselves, again for similarities, but also how gender played into the campaigns and how they became elected. The most important part of this was the rhetoric used and to what extent they emphasized their gender, things like that. And how I went about looking at this was through speech excerpts in their biographies or newspaper articles in which they were quoted. A number of them wrote op-ed pieces in some newspaper articles, both in national newspapers as well as local papers from their communities. So the results that I found, there were a number of similarities between two candidates and among all three. One of the limitations of this project is how to determine whether these similarities are just circumstantial or were significant. The ones that I've included here are ones that I think were significant, and they were ones that existed among all three. There are so many more we could get into, but these ones, they were all very well known in their community and or state prior to being elected. So they all had some sort of name recognition. They all had working mothers, which I thought was interesting. It's sort of an example of an independent woman. All their mothers were school teachers, which is a common profession, but I think that this also kind of had something to do with the fact that they were all from Midwestern or Western states, Montana, Oklahoma, and Illinois, respectively, which stood in stark contrast to the East Coast at the time and the traditional values that women were, perceived to exhibit, things like that. They all traveled extensively beyond their own hometowns, which plays into how well known they were in their communities. They all faced significant adversity in addition to being female, which I thought was interesting. One example was that Rankin did not receive support from Carrie Chapman Catt, who at the time was the president of NASA. She discouraged Rankin from running because she thought that Rankin would lose and that would discredit all women in the movement at the time, especially considering they were so close to getting suffrage passed. They all had progressive focuses. They were all part of this sort of part of the Republican Party at the time that focused on these issues that might now be considered women's issues or compassion issues, such as labor rights, veterans benefits, minimum wage, things like that. But I think it's important to point out that while they might be considered women's issues, they were things that were embraced by men and women across the political community. Most importantly, their focuses were results of past experiences, and I'll give a quick example for each woman. Rankin was highly active in the suffrage movement, not only in Montana, but in other states as well, throughout her 20s and early 30s leading up to her election. And of course, this is a women's issue, but she gained a lot of political experience lobbying before Congress, organizing other members of her community, things like that. And this was something she really focused on this experience in her campaign. Robertson, she actually grew up in Indian territory. Her parents were missionary school teachers, and Indian rights became her primary focus in her campaign. And throughout her life leading up to the election, she was in her 60s when she ran. And Huck actually grew up in a political family. She was elected by special election to fill her deceased father's seat, and she embraced many of his issues, the things that their family had fostered throughout her childhood, and things like pacifism, labor rights, and married women's rights. So then on to how gender affected these campaigns. This is where it gets kind of complex, and it differs a lot by candidate. Rankin, like I said, was an ardent suffragist, and she expressed many times the responsibility she felt to represent women and fight for their rights. Robertson, on the other hand, did not feel a particular need to represent women. She said explicitly, "I came here to represent my district, not women." She was very loyal to the soldiers and the farmers and the Native Americans of her community, of her state. And Huck was the first wife and mother in Congress. Rankin and Robertson were not married, so she put more emphasis on the fact that she was a mother and that she would bring a mother's point of view rather than being a woman and fighting for gender equality. So there are a lot of more nuances that I could get into, but these were the general trends that I picked out. So not one explicitly said that her gender was the key characteristic or the key justification for her getting elected. However, I think Rankin brought most attention to her gender, and this is probably a result of the fact that she was the first woman to win. She was very active in the suffrage movement, and people sort of brought that attention upon her, as the first woman to reach this position. All three, interestingly, thought that women would serve a useful role in Congress. They would sort of serve to clean it up as the antithesis to men's sort of dirty political games. They all mention a unique perspective that women would bring to Congress. And that, again, differs by candidate. Like I said, Huck focuses on the mother's point of view. But again, their rhetoric diverges when it comes to the degree to which they would represent other women. So in conclusion, I did find that a lot of key similarities exist, but I do think that I would have to delve even deeper into their biographies or look at a lot more early congresswomen to come up with a rule or a theory that would explain this collective breakthrough of women into Congress. Again, their campaign focuses definitely were more of a result from past experiences and the circumstances that surrounded their campaign rather than their gender. And as Perkins and Phelps had theorized, the three did not use gender as a primary qualification for their elections. Any questions? Yes.
How did you, what sources did you use in order to figure out, what were kind of the main focuses of their campaign, since it was so long ago?
Mm-hmm. A lot of their biographies, would explicitly list the things that they focused on and would, pull direct quotes from speeches and things like that. And I did look at newspaper articles a lot and and it was interesting because the nature of studying news articles, it's hard to, that gets into the whole idea of media coverage of these women. However, I did even see overlap. These articles would be quoting the same speeches, things like that. So I figured, okay, this must be a pretty important thing that she's saying or whatever. So that's where I got the most information for how they use their gender, how they had to kind of cope with that, and their perspectives on women in politics. Those were my sources. So yeah.
Oh, what was the primary problem? Did you have any problems in preparing this, or?
The primary problem is that there were three women, and they were all so different, and they all had very unique circumstances that sort of would make or break their election. For example, in Montana, when Jeanette Rankin ran, the two House seats were at large because they had just been awarded a second representative in the House of Representatives, but the borders hadn't been drawn for the districts. So she actually got second place in the election, but the two winners, first and second place winners, would become representatives. So if the border had been drawn in time for the election, who knows, like, what would have happened there. So there's sort of like interesting things that, you know, play into that, and it's hard to, you know, generalize based on that and generalize based on only 3 candidates. So that was a big struggle, but
Other questions?
okay, yeah.
You mentioned some of the challenges of using media, and we've talked about the different frames that are used for modern political women in campaigns today. Was there any of that? Now, I think it was Huck who actually portrayed herself as a mother. Other than that, did you see the same sort of frames being used by the media in order to cover these unique women?
A lot of the coverage of Rankin would talk about what she was wearing or her hair. There were some really interesting articles, primarily from the New York Times, that would talk about her as this sort of like wild Western pioneer gal, like coming in to be civilized by like Washington or something like that. Or like they mentioned that, oh, she's finally like calmed down and like ready to run for office. It was very interesting. And I read in some of their biographies that some newspapers were reluctant even to admit that they had won the election because they didn't want to like, you know, say that, oh, woman is in Congress all of a sudden. You know, it was like a very like sticky subject for a lot of them. But yeah, a lot of the articles focused on their appearance, things like that. Not necessarily, you know, the things that they said or the things they did. So. Yeah.